Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're going to be diving into some pretty heavy stuff, actually some stuff you sent to us.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the anxious generation, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness.
By Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, it's a really important book for understanding, I think, what's going on with young people today.
Yeah, and the main argument of the book is that the rise in anxiety and depression among Gen Z, those born after 1995, it's not a coincidence. It's connected to this idea of a great rewiring of childhood.
Yeah, and there are really two main shifts that he talks about that are part of this rewiring. One is the rise of this phone-based life,
right,
and the decline of real-world free play.
And in this deep dive, that's what we're going to be talking about. What are the different components of this rewiring, and what's the impact on the mental well-being of young people? Really extracting the most crucial insights from Haidt's work and bringing them to you.
Yeah, he starts off the book with this really interesting, kind of almost sci-fi analogy. He asks us to consider, what would it be like to raise the first generation of children on Mars? A totally alien environment, radically different from Earth, where human development has unfolded for eons,
Right.
And it makes you wonder, are we doing something similar to this generation?
Yeah, it's a very striking image.
Yeah.
Because it really highlights the scale of the changes that we're talking about when we talk about childhood.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of this great rewiring.
Okay.
When did this really start?
Well, he pinpoints the years between 2010 and 2015 as really being crucial.
Okay.
And this is when certain technological shifts went from being kind of novelties to being really kind of embedded in our everyday lives. Like high-speed internet became common in the 2000s. The iPhone arrived in 2007, and then around 2009, we had the like and share buttons appearing on social media.
Yeah, those little thumbs up.
Yeah, those little thumbs up that really changed everything. And then the book goes on to present a lot of data about the mental health of teenagers.
Right, and he presents a graph that's very striking.
Yeah.
It shows the percentage of U.S. teens aged 12 to 17.
Right.
Who reported having experienced at least one major depressive episode in the past year, and starting around 2012, it just shoots up.
Yeah, he calls it a hockey stick, like a flat line just suddenly shooting straight up, and that's the mental health of teens after 2012.
Wow. Yeah, and what's interesting is that the actual number of cases increased more for girls.
Right.
But the relative increase from 2010 was similar for both boys and girls, like a 150% jump. So depression became like 2.5 times more common.
Huge.
Yeah. And it's not just self-reporting, right?
No.
We also see a rise in diagnosed mental illnesses among college students during the 2010s.
Yeah, anxiety and depression in particular.
And there's also this data showing the youngest age groups, those entering Gen Z around 2014,
right.
They started reporting feeling nervous more often compared to like older millennials and other age groups.
Yes.
So there's definitely something that seems to have shifted for this generation.
Yeah. And the timing of this is crucial because the book also addresses other possible explanations for this trend, like
major national or global events.
Yeah, like the aftermath of 9/11 or the financial crisis of 2008,
right.
but the timing doesn't quite line up.
Yeah.
And also Haidt points out that often, when societies face collective threats, it can lead to people kind of banding together and not necessarily leading to depression.
And what about climate change?
Yeah, he acknowledges that that's definitely a legitimate concern, for young people. But he makes this distinction between collective threats and individual experiences of isolation. And it's that feeling of being alone and feeling isolated that tends to have a stronger link.
I see. To increases in mental illness.
Yeah, and this is something that he finds across cultures as well, right?
Yeah. He points out that similar patterns of rising anxiety and depression are seen in the Anglosphere. So countries like Canada and the UK, and even in the Nordic countries.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it seems to suggest some kind of universal underlying factor.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into these two core components of the Great Rewiring, starting with the decline of free play.
Oh.
Now, this is something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
Growing up, we had a lot more freedom to just go outside and play.
Right.
And Haidt makes this point that free play is not just some fun activity for kids.
Right.
It's the work of childhood.
Yeah. He calls it the work of childhood for all young mammals.
Yeah.
Think about puppies roughhousing or kittens chasing string.
Yeah.
They're not just having fun. They're developing their hunting skills and their social dynamics.
Right.
And it's the same for human children. So what are some of the specific benefits of free play?
Well, first of all, it's vital for developing social skills.
Okay.
Like conflict resolution and cooperation.
Yeah.
It helps children develop their physical coordination.
Yeah.
It helps them build emotional resilience because they're facing these small-scale challenges and setbacks. And it's also incredibly important for their cognitive development. It fosters their creativity and problem-solving abilities.
Okay, so it's like a crucial developmental toolkit.
Exactly.
But the argument is that this kind of play has been declining for a while.
Yeah, the decline really started in the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s.
Well, why is that?
Well, he points to a couple of things. One is the rising levels of parental fears, fueled by media coverage and these stranger danger narratives that became very prevalent.
Right, I remember those.
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
So parents became more hesitant to let their children play unsupervised outdoors. And the other major factor was the growing appeal of these indoor screen-based activities.
Yeah, as personal computers became more common in homes.
Exactly, and more engaging.
Yeah.
They offered a very compelling alternative to going outside to play.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he points out that unsupervised outdoor play actually decreased
Right. Yeah.
around the same time that personal computers started becoming household staples.
Yeah.
So it's like this shift from the real world to the virtual world was already starting to happen.
Right.
Even before smartphones.
Exactly.
And he uses this great analogy to explain, just how important real-world experience is.
Yeah.
He compares it to learning to walk.
Right.
You can watch all the videos you want about how to walk.
Yeah.
But ultimately, a baby needs to actually practice
Yeah.
to stumble and fall and get back up.
Exactly.
And it's the same for children. They need those direct real-world experiences.
They do.
Not just virtual simulations of them.
That's right.
And when we talk about early childhood development, there's this idea of serve and return interactions.
Yes.
Those back and forth exchanges between caregivers and young children.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that relate to the decline of play and the rise of screens?
Well, serve and return interactions are all about attunement and synchrony.
Okay.
Like a baby babbling and a parent responding with sounds and smiles, or a toddler
Right.
making a funny face and getting a reaction.
Yeah.
These interactions teach timing, and they teach children how to read social cues, and they foster this emotional connection.
But phone-based interactions are often very different.
They're often disembodied, they're asynchronous, and they're one-to-many.
Yeah.
They fundamentally lack that element of real-time reciprocal engagement.
So even though they're connecting in a way,
Yeah.
it's not the same kind of connection that's really crucial for development.
And the book also talks about the social dynamics that are learned through play. Peter Gray has done a lot of research on this, and he emphasizes that play requires children to learn to suppress that urge to always dominate.
Yeah.
So, through navigating those social dynamics in a low-stakes environment.
Like a game of tag or make-believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They learn to form those long-lasting cooperative bonds.
It's about learning to get along
Exactly.
with other people, even when you don't always get what you want.
Right.
And then there's also this aspect of physical risk in play that I think is often overlooked.
Yeah, he talks about the playground spinner.
Right.
That classic piece of equipment that, might seem a bit too risky by today's standards.
Yeah.
But he argues that those minor risks, those potential for bumps and bruises are actually really important. It's about bruises, not scars.
Okay.
Those small injuries are a necessary part of learning and developing resilience.
It's about learning your limits in a safe environment.
Exactly.
And the book actually cites some really interesting research that I think might surprise some parents about the relative safety of different types of play.
There's a researcher named Mariana Brusoni who has done a lot of work on this.
Okay.
And her research shows that risky outdoor play actually has a lower rate of injury per hour than adult supervised sports.
That's counterintuitive.
It is, but it's because in risky outdoor play, children are the ones making the decisions.
I see.
They're setting the rules, they're resolving conflicts.
Okay.
And she has this great recommendation. She says, keep children as safe as necessary.
Right.
Not as safe as possible.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the decline of free play. Let's move on to the other major component of the Great Rewiring.
Okay.
The rise of phone-based childhood.
All right.
Now, this is something that I think we've all witnessed.
We have.
Just the speed at which smartphone technology became ubiquitous.
It was revolutionary.
Yeah, it was really like on par with the societal impact of radio and television.
Right, but the difference is
Yeah.
the intensely personal and engaging nature of these devices.
Right, and even very young children
Yeah.
were able to master that touch and swipe interface.
Right, and a lot of parents probably saw this as, a convenient way to keep kids occupied.
Yeah, entertained.
Exactly.
Yeah. But Haidt refers to smartphones as being experience blockers in the hands of children.
They unlock a whole world of virtual experiences.
Right.
But at the same time, they reduce the amount of time that kids have
Yeah.
for real-world interaction.
And it's that fundamental trade-off, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
You get all these new virtual experiences,
right.
but you lose out on the real-world experiences
Yeah.
that are crucial for development.
And the book talks about how this affects the way that children are socialized. In the past, childhood typically involved a gradual introduction to age-appropriate experiences, often with peers of the same age.
Yeah.
But with this phone-based childhood, children are kind of plunged into this whirlpool of adult content and experiences online.
It's like they're being exposed to things that they might not be ready for.
Exactly.
And then there's social media, which I think plays a really big role in this.
Yeah.
How does social media kind of hijack that natural social learning process?
Well, social media platforms are designed to maximize user engagement.
Right.
And in doing so, they can kind of hijack the natural social learning processes.
Mm.
Children have these things called conformist and prestige biases.
Okay.
A conformist bias is the desire to copy what seems most common.
Right.
And a prestige bias is the desire to copy those who appear accomplished or high status.
Yeah.
And social media just amplifies these biases to an unprecedented degree. So it's focusing children's attention on online influencers and drowning out maybe the influence of their family and their local community.
So instead of learning from the people around them and their environment, they're learning from these often distant online personas.
That's right.
And this leads to the concept of anti-fragility that the book talks about.
Yeah, this is a really important idea. Yeah. Anti-fragility isn't just about being resilient or tough. It's about things that actually grow stronger as a result of stressors. And Haidt argues that human childhood evolved in the real world.
Right.
So children's minds are kind of expecting the challenges of that embodied synchronous environment.
But the virtual world is different.
It is very different.
Yeah.
In the virtual world, even small mistakes can have huge and lasting consequences.
Right, because things can go viral.
Exactly.
There's public shaming, digital content that never goes away.
Right.
So children haven't evolved the psychological defenses to handle that kind of environment.
He uses this analogy of falling on Mars versus falling on Earth. Yeah. On Earth, you fall down, you get back up.
Yeah. You might get a bruise.
Yeah.
But on Mars...
On Mars, a small fall could be fatal. Yeah.
Because it's such a hostile environment.
So it's like this mismatch between our evolved needs and the online world.
Exactly.
And then there's this point that the book makes about the rise of parental tracking of children through smartphones.
Yeah.
Which became really common around 2012.
Right.
And this is right around the same time that teen anxiety started to spike.
Exactly.
So he suggests that this increased monitoring might actually be contributing to anxiety.
Yeah.
It's reducing their sense of autonomy. Right. It's reducing that development of trust.
Yeah.
So we've got the timing, we've got the decline of free play, we've got the rise of phone-based childhood. Mm-hmm. And now Haidt gets into the 4 foundational harms that he says arise from all of this. Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction.
Yeah.
And these are the mechanisms through which he says phone-based childhood is really having a negative impact on mental well-being.
And let's delve into addiction a little bit, because it is a strong word.
It is.
But he makes a very compelling case.
Yeah. How so?
Well, the developers of these successful social media apps have employed all kinds of techniques from behaviorism.
Okay.
And they've drawn on the work of people like B.J. Fogg to really hook users.
So they're using these techniques to make the platforms more engaging.
Yeah, to create these reinforcing cycles of behavior and reward.
And the brain's reward system plays a role in this, right?
Absolutely. The release of dopamine in the brain when we engage with these platforms doesn't necessarily lead to satisfaction.
Right.
It fuels a desire for more.
Right.
More notifications, more likes, more scrolling.
Yeah, and Anna Lemke, who's an addiction researcher,
Yeah.
describes the withdrawal symptoms from these behavioral addictions as being things like anxiety, irritability, insomnia, a feeling of unhappiness or dysphoria.
Yeah, and it's very similar to what you see with substance abuse.
Yeah.
It's like the same brain mechanisms are being activated.
That's right.
Okay. And then you mentioned social deprivation.
Yeah.
Which seems counterintuitive because these platforms are all about connecting.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, while the number of online connections may increase, the quality of real-world relationships often suffers because you're spending so much time online that you have less time for those deeper face-to-face interactions that are so crucial for human connection.
So it's like quantity over quality.
Exactly.
And those virtual connections aren't really fulfilling those human needs.
They're not.
Okay, so let's talk about the differences between the impact on girls and boys.
Right.
So the book presents evidence that social media in particular has harmed girls more than boys.
It seems that way.
And around 2013, psychiatric wards started to see a much higher number of girls seeking help.
Yeah.
So what is it about social media that seems to be particularly harmful for girls?
Well, the visual nature of platforms like Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok seems to be playing a role.
Okay.
It's that constant exposure to highly curated and often unrealistic portrayals of beauty and life.
Right. It's like everyone's highlight reel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so girls' body image and self-esteem can really suffer.
Right.
And then there's this phenomenon of social comparison, which is really amplified in the online environment. So girls are constantly comparing themselves to these idealized, often heavily filtered online personas.
And their sociometer, which is their sense of social standing and worth.
Yeah, their internal sense of where they stand is just plummets.
Right, because it's hard to compete.
It is.
With those highlight reels.
Yeah.
And bullying has also changed. Right?
It has.
There's been a decrease in face-to-face bullying among boys, but there's been an increase in cyberbullying among girls.
Exactly. And that can be particularly harmful because it's relentless, it's often anonymous, and it can reach a much wider audience.
It's hard to escape.
Yeah.
And then there's this concept of mass sociogenic illness.
Or mass social media-induced illness.
Okay. And what is that exactly?
Well, this refers to the spread of certain symptoms through social influence.
Okay.
Like there was this observed rise in social media disorders resembling Tourette's syndrome among girls. And it seemed to be connected to some social media trends where certain influencers were displaying these tic-tacs.
Right.
And then there was this increase in girls identifying with dissociative identity disorder, which also seemed to be influenced by TikTok.
Wow. So it's like social media can actually shape symptoms and identities.
It can.
And there's also the data on friendships and loneliness.
Right.
So there's been a decline in the percentage of U.S. high school seniors who say that they have a few close friends that they get together with regularly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's been an increase in students reporting feeling lonely.
Right after 2012.
So despite being more connected than ever, they're actually feeling more lonely.
That's the irony.
Okay, so for girls, it seems to be this social comparison.
Yeah.
Body image issues, cyberbullying, and then even this potential for social contagion of symptoms.
Yeah.
What about boys? How has this affected them?
Well, the impact on boys seems to be somewhat different, but still significant.
Yeah.
He suggests that the rise of safetyism, this emphasis on keeping children safe at all costs, coupled with maybe a perceived decline in traditional societal value for masculinity, might have pushed boys toward the virtual world, and particularly online gaming, as real-world opportunities for agency and risk-taking and peer interaction decrease.
Like the real world became less appealing.
Yeah.
So they found this alternative online space.
And then there's the issue of pornography.
Right.
With high-speed internet, boys gained access to online pornography at unprecedented rates.
Yeah.
And this can potentially impact their views on relationships and intimacy in the real world.
And even though the specific ways that it manifests might be different from girls, boys are also experiencing this increased loneliness.
Yeah, they are.
And the book introduces this concept of anomie.
Yeah.
Which is a state of normlessness.
Right. a lack of clear social guidelines.
Okay.
And this can result from the rapid and constant flux of these online networks.
It's like the rules are constantly changing.
Exactly. And when everything's changing so quickly,
Yeah.
it can be difficult for a stable moral framework and a sense of meaning to develop.
Right.
So it contributes to this feeling of meaninglessness.
So even though the pathways might be different for boys and girls,
Yeah.
both genders are experiencing negative consequences.
That's right.
In terms of mental health and social connection.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention, fragmentation, addiction, and now Haidt gets into what he calls spiritual degradation.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting concept.
It is.
Now, he uses the term spirituality in a broad sense.
Yes, not necessarily tied to religion.
Right, it's more about a connection.
Yeah, a connection to something larger than yourself.
Yeah, to something transcendent.
Exactly.
And he draws on the work of Emile Durkheim, who's a sociologist.
Yes.
And he talks about the profane, which is our everyday self-focused consciousness, and the sacred, which is the realm of collective shared experience.
And in traditional societies, rituals played this role of helping people move between those realms, you know, fostering a sense of belonging and shared experience.
And the argument is that the virtual world is primarily profane.
It is.
It's all about me and my online persona.
Right.
And it's not really about that shared collective experience.
That's right.
And then he talks about the brain.
Right.
Specifically, the default mode network.
Yeah, the DMN. And how does that relate? Well, the default mode network becomes less active during moments of self-transcendence and connection to something beyond ourselves. But social media tends to keep our focus on the self. You know, on self-presentation, personal branding, tracking our social standing.
Yeah.
So it keeps the DMN very active.
It's like our brains are constantly in this self-referential mode.
Exactly.
And it's making it harder to connect with something larger.
That's right.
And social media also encourages this constant judgment and evaluation of others.
It's all about comparison, and it incentivizes us to judge other people.
And that's the opposite of what a lot of spiritual traditions
emphasize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Non-judgment, compassion, understanding.
And then there's the importance of awe and nature.
Yeah.
So how do those fit into this? Well, awe-inspiring experiences, particularly in nature, have been shown to shift our focus away from our own self-concerns, and they improve our well-being.
Right.
And even simple practices like awe walks.
What's an awe walk?
It's when you intentionally seek out moments of wonder in your surroundings, have been shown to have a positive impact on students' mental health.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And he quotes the Buddha and Marcus Aurelius.
He does.
On the importance of what we expose our minds to.
Yeah, and in a phone-based life, so much of that exposure is curated by algorithms.
And it's often pulling us towards the superficial and the judgmental.
That's right.
So this spiritual degradation encompasses this loss of connection, this heightened self-focus, this tendency towards judgment, and this reduced engagement with awe-inspiring experiences.
It's a really profound impact.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
So the core message here is that this shift towards phone-based childhood and the decline in free play is linked to the rise in anxiety and depression.
And it's a really strong link.
Yeah. And it can feel really overwhelming to think about all of this.
Yeah.
But the book does offer some hope, right?
Yeah, it does.
It suggests that understanding these factors can help us create change.
Yeah. Yes. And he talks about collective action.
Yeah.
You know, involving parents, schools, tech companies, even governments.
Right.
You know, we can work together to reverse these trends.
And to create a healthier environment for children.
That's right.
So as you've been listening to this deep dive, you know, we want you to think about what is your own relationship with technology?
Yeah.
How do you balance your virtual experiences with your real world experiences?
Yes.
And how might these insights about Gen Z resonate with you? You know, maybe think about that aspect of spiritual degradation and opportunities that you might have to cultivate more awe and connection in your own life and in the lives of those around you.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.